Welcome everybody, thank you for tuning in once again for another review here at theloamwolf.com. Today, we are very excited to report back on our long-term review of the Cannondale Jekyll 1. Their completely redesigned mid-high pivot enduro bike that we are excited to also be giving away to one of our lucky viewers. So stay tuned, I'll tell you how to win this bike and what we think about this long-legged enduro machine. All right, so first up, let's address the giveaway. First things first, don't fall for any comments down below that say you have won. We will not be letting you know through some other third-party account or anything like that, or asking you to text us money. We will reach out to you directly, so don't fall for any scammy, spammy comments. That being said, we are gonna link the phone number down below. Send us a text message that says, keep me updated, and we will be sure to blast out a text that lets you know just how to enter to win this bike. But in the meantime, shoot us a text and subscribe to the channel. Those are gonna be the two places that we announce how this giveaway is gonna work. So thank you guys, and of course, thanks to Cannondale for making that happen. We did a very in-depth dissected feature on this bike several months back when it first came out. We had an interview with Scott Vogelman of Cannondale. It was really informative. We were able to interview him and ask a lot of really cool questions, share some very cool studies that they did regarding friction, drag, resistance from that idler pulley setup. And it was just a very cool video. So if you didn't check that out, be sure you do. We'll also include that down below or a little link. Today, we're gonna focus a lot more on the ride aspect of this thing, hopefully answer some of the questions you have about if this bike's the right bike for you and where we think it stacks up. So, geometry on this thing, I thought was pretty solid. At 5'11", we opted for a size large. I'm sure you guys have heard us say we love 475 to 480 reach. This thing has 475 reach. It is right where we want it to be. It's a happy, comfortable bike. It's not too long, it's not too short. I think it does a good job of blending some kind of snappy, quicker handling, but also gives the stability that you want at higher speeds, chunky, rough terrain, or going down some real steep stuff. Head tube angle, I think, is pretty solid at 64 degrees. Our size large also has 442 millimeter chainstays. Obviously, one of the things with a high pivot is the rear end and wheelbase as a whole grows as that bike goes through the travel. Being that this is a mid-high pivot, the rearward axle path is only about 10 millimeters, and a lot of it's probably going in just into the sag as well, but then the arc starts coming back up and forward, so it's not quite as drastically rearward as like a Canfield or a Norco or some of the other bikes that have a much higher pivot, and that is, in our opinion, a benefit. We are not totally sold on high pivots in general, but if we were gonna pick a high pivot, we probably would pick a mid-high pivot, at least for a well-rounded bike, right? Maybe for an all-out downhill machine, if our only real concern was like just swallowing up big hits and charging at speed, a higher pivot bike definitely has its merits. There just are some quirks to them, and they're not for everybody, so we'll move on from there and kind of touch on that later. Cannondale uses a really cool proportional response design philosophy, concept, whatever you want to call it, and essentially what they do is every size bike has its own rear center length, it has its own pivot locations, leverage rate, suspension kinematics, all of those things are modified slightly. And I think what's really cool about that is they're not having to actually machine or mold different length chainstays. So, a dealer, for example, isn't gonna have to stock 3 different chainstay lengths. They simply move these points on the seat tube ever so slightly, and that changes not only the length of the rear center without having to have different chainstay lengths, but it also gives different suspension kinematics, again, leverage ratio, all that stuff changes by the movement of that pivot location ever so slightly. And along with giving you a kind of more finely tuned rear center length, that gives you a suspension platform that feels better for your average weight, right? So obviously a rider that's 5'4" is probably not gonna weigh as much as a rider who's 6'2", and so because of that, they have adjusted the kinematics a bit to kind of offer a little bit more of an optimal ride for the widest range of riders in that size. I felt that Cannondale did a pretty solid job. You know, again, 5'11", 170 to 174 pounds. Fairly solid tune. I was quite happy with this bike. Didn't require a whole lot of tuning or adjusting. Obviously that is pretty nice because accessing the shock is a little bit tricky. The compression and low speed rebound adjustments are fairly easy to access. However, to get to the high speed rebound, you have to remove this little plate down here, the cover for the gravity cavity. And that's a little bit of a bummer. I don't know how often you guys are changing or adjusting your rebound, if you're, you know, going to different conditions or a trail versus if you're going to, you know, a big jump trail and you might want to change your rebound. That's something worth noting. It is pretty difficult to access without pulling that plate off, which isn't a huge deal. It's just a couple Allen wrenches or a couple of Allen bolts, excuse me, to remove that plate, but still worth noting. The bike overall felt really good. Day one out on this bike, felt comfortable at home. Really didn't need a lot of tuning, which was great. I didn't do very much tuning after the fact with the bike. I think the anti-rise and anti-squat were pretty solid. The bike performed well under braking. It did well on big hits. It did well on jump trails. I would say one area where the bike wasn't super great was climbing. As you know, you could probably imagine from a fairly longer travel, high pivot enduro bike with an Assegai tire, you know, it's definitely a little bit slower going up the hill compared to like the GT, which we're also reviewing, as well as the Norco range. All those bikes are kind of together in the same spot, right? When they're climbing, those three bikes are gonna be a little bit off the back compared to some other bike platforms. But, you know, I wouldn't necessarily say it's like a deal breaker bad, but it's definitely noticeable that, you know, guys or girls that you normally ride with, and if you're in a group, you're gonna have to either push a little bit harder or just kind of relegate yourself to being like, I might drop back a bike length and try to conserve some energy. Although you don't need to conserve that much energy because this thing just eats up the downhills. It is smooth, it is fast, confident, and surprisingly playful. I would say that out of all of the high pivot bikes we have, which is the GT, the Norco, and this is probably the bike that is the liveliest, the most fun on mellower trails, on jump trails, when you want to pop and play, try to throw a little bit of style as best as you can. This bike definitely rewards that type of riding the most. At 35.5 pounds, it's definitely the lighter in the mix of those high pivot machines. So I don't know how much that has to do with it, or if it's just that suspension tune. In that interview for our Dissected series, we found out that Cannondale made some conscious decisions when designing that suspension tune on this bike and the kinematics, whereas you know, they said their sister brand, I guess, whatever you want to call that, GT, they designed that bike. You know, it was a little bit of a different team. There was some crossover between the two teams designing those bikes at the same times, but there was also some differences. And GT's goal was to make a little bit more of like an aggressive racer inspired suspension tune, and a bike that really rewards riders who want to get after it, are after the clock, and push down fast lap times. Cannondale wanted to have a little bit safer, a little more moderate of a tune, something that would fit a broader audience comfortably, and that would allow riders to, you know, tune it by adding some volume reducers if they want to get after it on race day, but they could also have a casual ride with their friends and not feel like they're getting bounced and bucked around, or like the bike's beating the crap out of them if they're not charging at 95% riding speed. Cannondale would be probably the bike that we would choose out of the mix. I think it just is a versatile bike. It doesn't have quite as extreme of the hang-ups that some of the full crazy high pivot bikes do. It just is it's a more fun bike to ride. I really like the way it looks at $6,100 for this build spec. I'd say it's a pretty decent value all around. Obviously there's some little things here and there, like the wheels, you know, we've heard some people have had some issues with. Ours have held up pretty well for the time being. Exo Plus rear tire. It's a tough call because we ride in a really rocky area, and while we would like the flat protection, this thing's already a little bit of a pain to climb, so I don't know that we'd want that extra, you know, rotating weight either. So, you know, I guess maybe it's a good call that they let people pick if they want a burlier tire or not. Cannondale does offer a $4,500 complete version as well as a $3,700 frame set. So you've got a few options available depending on what kind of budget or perceived value you have out of each of those options. So where do I think this bike excels? I would say definitely excels at speed, rough, chunky, steep trails, whether that's rocks or roots. It also does well on jump trails. It definitely likes bigger, longer lips because that slightly extending wheelbase can act up a little bit when you're trying to pop off like smaller lips. Similarly, if you're in kind of tight, successive like linked up corners and you want to kind of press in and preload and pop or snap the bike out into the next corner, bike does lengthen just a little bit, right? And again, it's less than some others, but it does get a little longer and there's a slight learning curve to it. It's not massive. Overall, it wouldn't be a major, I guess, downfall of the bike, I would say, but it is something worth noting. Also, like we said with the Norco range and all the other high pivot bikes that we have reviewed, as you can probably see, we have a lot of jagged, uneven rock, especially a lot of lava rock here in Bend. So if you're going off very slow speed drops and there's an uneven takeoff and there's like a hole or a crack in that rock or surface as you're going off that drop, as that rear wheel hits that drop, the front of your bike continues going, as does your mass. The rear wheel stays in that hole for just a split second because essentially it's getting longer. So the front of the bike is continuing to pull away and that back tire hangs up before that wheel path comes up and lets go essentially out of that hole. And if you're going off a very slow speed kind of half pedal or low speed drop, 5-6 feet, it's just enough to kind of get you to go, oh crap, what's happening? And then the bike comes and lets go. That's something that I think is worth talking about. It's obviously not found on every trail we ride, but if it's on your regular features or your regular loop, there will be a little learning curve and it might make you nervous the first ride or two, but you'll adapt, you'll kind of get used to it, but it's worth noting, right? It's there. So there it is, folks, the Jekyll in a nutshell. We'd like to once again thank Cannondale for letting us do a Dissected, a long-term review, and of course now give this bike away to one of you guys. So make sure you subscribe to the channel, send a text message to that number below saying keep me informed, and we will be letting you guys know very soon when this giveaway is open for entry. Don't fall for anyone else reaching out to you and telling you won. It's not real. Thank you guys very much for watching. We greatly appreciate you and we hope to see you out on the trails.